many people with actually very good jobs in oil and gas, in coal, will face a very similar kind of question, right? I mean, where will my future livelihood be? Where will I get an income? Are my skills still needed?
In some shape or form, and sometimes by different wording, politicians around the world are either calling for or already working on a Green Deal, creating jobs while decarbonising our economies. And indeed, it does sound like a stellar plan, battling climate change on the one hand, while creating jobs on the other hand. But is the rise of renewables really connected to a substantial increase in jobs? And if so, what kind of jobs is the energy transition translating into? Is it low-wage jobs? Is it jobs for educated engineers? Or is it jobs for office workers? And are these jobs really being created within the countries that are leveraging the energy turnaround? Or are these jobs actually being created at the other end of the world? Stay tuned for an insight into the job-creating power of renewables, with some hard facts and figures taken from the latest report by IRENA, the International Renewable Energy Agency. Welcome to the Smartery Podcast, a podcast for and with the creators of the new energy world. A world in which energy will be renewable, decentralized and digital, bringing together electricity, heat and mobility. Let us show you how we will get there and who will get us there. As my guest for this episode, I'm very happy to welcome Michael Renner, who's the Program Officer in IRENA's Knowledge Policy and Finance Center in Abu Dhabi, with a special focus on the socioeconomic benefits of renewable energy. Welcome, Michael.
Thank you very much. Glad to be with you.
Awesome to have you here. And today's really gonna be a very much number and figure driven conversation. So before we really dive into the hard facts, a quick question. For you personally, what was maybe the most surprising thing that you took from this report?
Well, I think what's quite surprising is that the number of countries where we now see employment being created in renewable energy is really widening quite a lot, right? I mean, we got a lot of attention, and the big numbers are still about a handful of countries, but you can really look in all regions of the world now and see that actual real jobs are being created in wind, in solar, in bioenergy, and so on, really pretty much everywhere around the planet. So that's, I think it's a very nice surprise of sorts, I think.
Absolutely, that's a pleasant surprise, and also specifically after so many months of crisis mode all around the world. Before we get into the specific regions, maybe let's gather some total numbers. So what are the current figures?
Right, so we do an annual assessment based on, really we look at a very broad range of studies and reports. We do some of our own calculations, our own estimates. So this is, I think, probably the most comprehensive attempt to figure out like how many jobs are there really in renewable energy nowadays, right? Both directly and in the supply chain. Now, our most recent available report, which was put out in the fall of 2020, looks at the year 2019. And there we found that worldwide we have something like 11.5 million jobs in this sector. This is up, for comparison purposes, this is up from about 7.3 million back in 2012. So we have a very steady growth, very encouraging trend in this regard. Let me just maybe say briefly, this of course, depending on what energy technology you look at, the picture varies a fair bit. As you, and I'm sure many of the listeners will know, solar and wind are really the most dynamic sectors at this point. The solar photovoltaic industry is now the leading employer. We have something like 3.8 million jobs worldwide, about a third of the total. And this is followed by biofuels, by hydropower, wind, and solar heating and cooling. Biomass, actually also a fairly significant sector. Then some of the others like geothermal energy are much, much smaller. Let me talk a little bit. You had asked about, what are the leading countries. So China is definitely quite the dominant force here. And again, this will probably not come as a surprise. We estimate the Chinese employment across the renewable energy landscape at about 4.4 million jobs. Now, the European Union as a bloc accounts for something like 1.3 million. And then Brazil has a very similar number, 1.2 million about. And India and the US are at just below 1 million each. So these 5 areas of the world, countries/regions, are really very, very dominant. And I should probably say that that's not really a surprise. I mean, in the first place, these countries together account for a very large share of the population around the world. They account for a very large share of the global economy. And more specifically to renewable energy, they are major installation markets. They are, in most cases, very major sources of the equipment and the various inputs that are required for renewable energy. And so they really play very central roles. But as I said before, we do now see at a smaller scale still, we do see more and more countries coming in and really having a presence in this regard as well.
So when you talk about smaller countries coming in, which ones do you think have the biggest potential at the moment to really profit from the energy turnaround in sense of really creating jobs as well?
You know, in general, a number of Asian countries have been doing well and are continuing to do well. I mean, again, in addition to China, of course, now, right? So if you look at, for example, Southeast Asia, we now see countries like Malaysia, like Thailand, the Philippines, Vietnam, becoming very important players in the solar photovoltaic field. Malaysia really started this off by attracting a lot of foreign direct investment to produce PV panels. Much of that investment comes either from China or from Europe or the US. This is mostly foreign direct investment. It's not so much a strictly domestically grown industry. But Malaysia has now slowly over the years actually not just turned itself into an export hub, but it's also really has a growing domestic market. The same is actually true when you look at Vietnam, for example. They have come literally out of nowhere. Within 2 to 3 to 4 years, they have really built up a very significant PV industry. And again, both in terms of producing the equipment, but also really installing it more and more domestically. And they have really, I think 2019 and 2020, they have become a very, very major market. I mean, this was, I think, initially a very big surprise to many observers. But they have just taken a very solid interest in this field, which is very encouraging, of course.
I think that makes sense. If I think back to some of our other episodes, we talked about off-grid being very big in Asia. And I assume that then probably covers a big part of what you say when they start installing in their own markets. But before we talk about the kind of jobs that are in demand, just is there an even balance usually between the countries who are working on a Green Deal, such as the EU, and also the job creation? Because, of course, when you think back in Germany, which was leading in production at some point, and then it all went to China. So how much does it really translate into jobs being created on site?
I think that's an excellent question. And I think you need to look by country. You also need to look a little bit what energy technology, renewable energy technology, are we really discussing, right? Because it's very true for solar PV, as you say, that Germany was in many ways very much the pioneer in terms of policy development, in terms of domestic installations. And that then very dramatically changed as China really rose very, very quickly to prominence and to dominance, in effect, right? So many of the jobs on the manufacturing side of the supply chain were lost in Germany. It was a fairly dramatic development there. But if you look at, for example, the wind sector, and particularly the offshore wind sector, it's a very different story. Right? There, it's Europe that maintains a very strong technological lead, a very strong policy lead. So you have countries like Germany, like the UK, like Denmark playing a very major role. This is while China is also rising very significantly in the sector in recent years. But the European technology development, I think, still has a very big leg up on practically everybody else. You see this, for example, even within Europe, right? If you look at the United Kingdom as being a very major installation market now, offshore wind, much of the supply chain for their sector actually is located abroad. It's not located in the UK. So that many of the job benefits actually are incurred in mainland Europe on the continent itself. In some ways, the same is true for the United States as well. They have had a strong interest in onshore wind. They are now also beginning to really become a force in offshore wind. But again, the supply chain, I think, is something that needs to be built out there still. And so the implication is that those countries that really have been the pioneers in this regard are much more benefiting in terms of job creation on that side of the equation.
So it really depends on the different sectors you look at, whether it's photovoltaic or wind, and then some countries directly benefit in production sense, other countries still have to catch up. But what kind of qualifications are currently in particular demand? Is it engineers? So is it people in production, highly educated people in production? Is it more in the commercial area like trade, sales, marketing, consulting? Is it the installers? Or is it some low-wage jobs in the factory just assembling nuts and bolts?
In principle, I think the answer is really all of the above, right? I mean, I think there is a need when you look at from the very beginnings of the supply chain of an renewable energy project to the very end of it, you really need a lot of different kinds of occupations and skills. And I think all the categories that you mentioned are highly relevant. Now, how this plays out in terms of the numbers, of course, depends a little bit, again, on the particular technology and the particular country. To what extent is a Germany or a China or any other country really very actively presented in manufacturing and installations and construction and so on? For the construction and installation side and for the operations and maintenance side, I think it's much, much easier for most countries to say, we can actually provide these jobs, or we can create jobs for people domestically rather than having to rely on imports and on people having these jobs elsewhere. I think the other thing that's really worth highlighting, there is, there's some distinctions to be made between jobs in construction, which, tend to really be needed in very large numbers for a relatively short period of time as a project is being constructed. But then in principle, these jobs fall by the wayside unless there is another project that comes into play. And, the construction workers can be put to work there as well then. Whereas on the other side, in operations and maintenance, I mean, these are in effect really permanent jobs because a typical wind or solar project can easily operate for 20, 25 years. So there's a certain permanence involved in that and a much more steady pace of the labor needs.
And I guess that actually is good news for everybody working on a Green Deal because those are literally local jobs.
That's exactly. And I think a lot of countries, a lot of policymakers are really paying very, very close attention to that, and not surprisingly so, because I mean, this is particularly now that we are around the world all dealing with this health pandemic and the impacts from the lockdowns and the disruptions that we have seen. I think the need to create jobs and to the extent possible, of course, good jobs, well-paying jobs, is something that is even more on the minds of policymakers and the public alike than was the case already before.
And may I jump in with a spontaneous question there? Because obviously it's a new technology, and with new factories being set up, there's a huge potential to just automate much of the production process. Is that a risk for that sector? Or do you say because, for example, maintenance, on the other hand, will always have to be done manually? So are these safe jobs in 10 years, or will those jobs then be automated?
It's a good question. I think we have to observe a little bit how this will play out. But I think your point, or what you're pointing to, is very well taken. We do already see, some automation, quite a bit of automation in the production of PV panels, for example. We do see some automation in terms of the cleaning of panels in the field that have been installed already. So I think we already see indications that, as was the case in practically any other industry in this world, there is going to be growing automation, growing mechanization. There will be learning curves that are being negotiated, which typically lead to saying we can do this with fewer people than we needed initially. There will be more and more growing scales of installation. I mean, we see this very much so, of course, in the wind energy sector, right, where the blades and the towers just keep getting bigger and bigger and bigger, and that has implications. We now see already the initial inroads of artificial intelligence, right? Again, where you can, for example, inspect whether the equipment holds up well, the quality of the equipment, or whether it functions well. You can often do that by drone, more quickly, more reliably than you can do it by the human eye. So I think there is a certain, a certain inevitability, the fact that over time, these industries will need fewer people per project, per megawatt installed than is the case now.
You already mentioned that obviously photovoltaic is one of the most interesting industries. We've talked about wind. When we talk specifically, for example, about battery storage and electromobility, is that an interesting growth field currently? For example, in Europe, there's a dynamic development with VW and Tesla planning big factories. Is that an area that also creates job, or are these highly automated factories?
I mean, of course, again, it's a bit of a mix, right? I mean, you will definitely create jobs by investing, by putting in factories, by making sure that your supply chain gets organized, right? I mean, because of course, you need to look at not only the technology that goes into this, but also the material supplies. So depending on where the supply chain really is located, or where parts of the supply chain are located, this is where you will definitely create a fairly significant number of jobs. Now, again, this is subject to, I think, things like automation, things like artificial intelligence, and so on, no question. But when you look at the landscape in the battery industry, much of this, of course, right now is taking place in China and in other Asian countries. So I think the growing interest and commitment on the part of European countries to say we need to invest in this, we need to make sure some of this is more local to us, it will make a huge difference. And I think the same is playing out in North America, in the United States. And I think this is just, everybody recognizes that to the extent that we need to have not just an energy transition, but also a mobility transition, for example, right? So to electrify our transport systems to the extent that they aren't already, that will create growing interest and growing need in this regard.
When you talk about battery storage and electric mobility, you usually start talking about hydrogen as well, maybe not in regards to mobility, but certainly for the decarbonization of other hard-to-abate sectors. So can you already see an influence of hydrogen technologies creating jobs?
I think it's a little hard to say because the available information is very, very scarce at this point, right? But I think we see a lot of excitement, a lot of talk about hydrogen and about specifically green hydrogen. I think that the challenge is, in my view, is really huge because much of the existing hydrogen industry, of course, is now natural gas based. And I think while we can certainly say, let's try to focus on renewables as much as possible as we move forward, I think the challenge is that even with these very encouraging growth rates in the renewable energy sector, we really face multiple challenges all at once. We try to decarbonize the power sector, we try to decarbonize the heating and cooling sector, we try to decarbonize the transportation sector, how to decarbonize industrial sectors. So trying to satisfy all of these requirements and all of these interests to decarbonize will be very, very difficult. So I think it will be a matter of a number of years before this can really play out as well as we would like it to play out.
I think in the EU there's a lot of focus on hydrogen, but in other regions of the world, I guess one should not forget to talk about biofuels as well. So are biofuels a big factor in other regions of the world?
They are in a number of places, and I think again we see, as is the case with with solar and wind, there is of course the question: where is some of this being produced, and where is it actually then being used? Where is it being sold to? And so, if you look at the big producers, right, the US definitely leading the field, but then there's countries like Brazil. There's a number of Southeast Asian countries like Indonesia, Malaysia, the Philippines, other countries like Colombia, and so on play a big role. What we see there is of course that the agricultural supply chain, right? I mean, basically growing the feedstock and then harvesting the feedstock that you need for these fuels. That is really the major element in terms of the jobs creation that we are looking at. But we need to be very clear, I think, about the fact that many of the jobs in that regard in the agricultural supply chain are typically not very high quality jobs, right? I mean, if you look at the sugarcane industry, for example, in Brazil, the jobs there are physically very, very demanding. They are typically fulfilled by people who don't have much of an education, don't have much of a skill base, so they really don't have much of an alternative in terms of where can they secure employment. Now, what we're seeing playing out, though, is there is growing automation, right? So you need fewer and fewer of these people. Now, you could say maybe that's a good thing because you create fewer but better jobs. But if you are somebody who really depends on his livelihood for cutting down sugarcane, then what are your options, right? So I think governments need to look very, very carefully at how can they facilitate a process where, people whose jobs are now going to likely fall by the wayside because of automation, because of changing dynamics, how can we help them to actually make them transition as well to a more sustainable job?
I think that's quite interesting what you said, is that when in regards to biofuels, the job creation really is at the very bottom of the supply chain. So in the actual creation of the feedstock, as you said. And yes, of course, that's quite an important point, is that if you have somebody working in the fields on sugar canes, that's not a person you're going to turn into an engineer then working on a hydrogen solution 5 years later. So it makes absolute sense to have the regulators or the policymakers come up with schemes that work and do not leave certain areas of the society behind.
Exactly. And if I may add, I think this is an issue that I think applies not just to biofuels and perhaps countries in the developing world, but I think very much to all the other countries as well, right? Because if we are talking indeed about an energy transition, which entails moving from fossil fuels to renewable energy, to energy efficiency, and so on, then many people with actually very good jobs in oil and gas, in coal, will face a very similar kind of question, right? I mean, where will my future livelihood be? Where will I get an income? Are my skills still needed? Can I actually develop an expertise and a skill set that really is still in demand? And I don't think we can assume that this is really just up to the individual. I think there's a real need for society at large to say, this is a society-wide undertaking, this energy transition. It needs to be done on behalf of everybody. But it means that certain people will shoulder costs far more directly than others. And I think we need to really help them along. We need to facilitate their their reskilling efforts. We need to give them a perspective in this new energy world. And I think we have to really be prepared to see this through, because it will not play out in a very short amount of time. It will take years and perhaps to some extent decades.
Talking about decades, I would love now towards the end of the podcast talk about possible predictions. And it's a couple of questions maybe you can tie together in your answer. On the one hand, I would love to know, because your numbers are from 2019, as you said. 2020, it's been a great year for solar specifically. So is an increase in the sector, does that mean an equal increase in jobs? Or not really, because it's just factories scaling their output, not really creating more jobs? That's one question. And the other question is also, if we see a shift from, as you mentioned, the oil sector, the gas sector towards renewables, is the same kind of amount of jobs being created in the renewable energy sectors? Is it more jobs? Is it less jobs? Is there a balance in this shift?
Let me maybe actually take the second question first, because our work and the work of others indicates quite clearly that the number of jobs that are being created per dollar or per euro spent is significantly higher still in renewable energy than in fossil fuels, I think to a factor of about 1 to 3. So that, I think, for the time being, at least, is a very positive picture. But as we were talking about earlier in the podcast, I think there's no doubt that, of course, the labor intensity of renewable energy will not stay as high as it is right now. So that will change over time, at least to some extent. Now, the question is a little bit, what happens from 2019, 2020 on forward? We, I think, have now gotten very encouraging news in terms of how have renewables fared in terms of the handling the pandemic. They have actually done, I think, far better than most of us have really dared to dream. So my colleagues actually just came out the other day with the new renewable energy statistics, the capacity statistics, and they actually indicate that the amount of renewable energy added in 2020 by far surpassed that installed in 2019. So it's a very, very encouraging picture. And our own modeling work, we actually modeled a couple of scenarios in the energy transition to 2030 and to 2050. Our own modeling work indicates that we can expect a fairly significant jobs growth in those coming decades.
I think that's almost a great statement to end with already. So, as you mentioned, there's a much better rate of dollar invested in relation to jobs being created in the renewable sector than it is in the traditional energy sector. On top of that, you said that we can still count in a steep growth curve, of course, on the one hand in the employment of renewables, but also then that translating into the job market. And it's quite interesting, as you said, because it is a very, very versatile picture. Are you talking at jobs at the bottom of the supply chain being connected to really a lot of hard manual labor that might be automated in the future? Or are you talking about high-skilled jobs somewhere in the development of new technologies? And it's also quite interesting that different regions of the world really have to tackle different problems because they cover other spectrums within the supply chain. So thanks a lot for providing all these hard facts, numbers, and examples. I guess the report is for download on your website. And by the way, you also have a very cool feature on your website. I saw on the landing page, if you scroll down a bit, you can actually type in the region you're in, and then you have a graph spitting out the energy mix for that specific region. How much wind, how much solar, how much biofuel. I really love that, and I encourage everybody to check out the landing page of IRENA. Thanks for joining us today, Michael.
Well, thank you very much for having me. I really enjoyed it.
Stay tuned for more episodes of the Smarter E podcast. Learn more about the latest developments in the new energy world on the Smarter E Europe. Europe's largest platform for the energy industry. You can find infos online at thesmartere.de.